Well, let's get started here. So welcome everyone to the virtual USS Constitution Museum for our conversation with author Ben Mezrich of The Mechanic. I'm Ed Sevilla, and I'm the Chief Development Officer of the museum, and I'll be your host today. At the museum, we really believe that the stories of old Ironsides are as relevant today as they were during the War of 1812. And this spring, we were all reminded of this when the Boston Globe published the smash hit novella, The Mechanic, written by today's guest, Ben Mezrich. As you know, the action-packed novella includes scenes on USS Constitution right outside the museum. And today we're going to hear a lot more about history and how the ship and history are intertwined into this pop cultural phenomenon that is the Mechanic. So first, let me tell you some technical and housekeeping notes. Here's how we'll spend our time together. First, Ben will say a few words about the Mechanic, and we'll do a reading from the novella. And then I'll have a question and answer session with Ben, including questions that some of you in the audience have submitted ahead of time. Please go ahead and submit and send in any additional questions you have for Ben using the Q&A function in Zoom. Hopefully many of you have been using Zoom, so you can find the Q&A function. And of course, feel free to use the chat function for your own conversations during the session. And then after Ben and I discuss a few questions, we'll turn to more audience questions and go through as many as we can before we wrap up around 1:50. So now let me briefly introduce our guest. Ben Mezrich is an international best-selling author and one of the true treasures of Boston. He has written 20 books with well over 6 million copies sold. You may be familiar with, we'll cue up some book covers here for you shortly. You may be familiar with Bringing Down the House, which is about the MIT students who took Las Vegas for millions of dollars. And that spent 63 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. And many of you may have seen the hit motion picture 21, which is based on. The Accidental Billionaires, about the founding of Facebook, also New York Times bestseller, and became the Oscar-nominated hit movie, The Social Network. His most recent book is Bitcoin Billionaires, and also currently, Ben is a writer and consulting producer for the hit TV show Billions. And so welcome, Ben. Welcome to the virtual USS Constitution Museum.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. I'm happy to be here. So
that's great, great to have you. So many of the folks with us online may have read The Mechanic, but in case some have not done so yet, can you give us a brief synopsis of The Mechanic, from the author's perspective? What's this about?
Sure. So this was a thriller I wrote. It's kind of in the style of a Da Vinci Code or National Treasure. It takes place all in Boston, pretty much in the streets of Boston, a lot of it along the Freedom Trail. It was written as a novella that appeared in the Boston Globe on a daily basis for 2 weeks. So basically chapters were coming out every morning and every night, which was completely insane. And I was basically writing it along with the people reading it. It's about a mystery that involves Revolutionary War figures. I don't want to give it away too much for people who haven't read it, but most of you I think have read it. And it really just delves into a history that maybe many of us think we know, but isn't exactly as we know it. And about these characters who uncover what may be one of the most important discoveries of our time. That's the way I guess I would say it. But it's a thriller. It's a fun kind of action-packed thing that just takes place in the streets of Boston.
Well, that's terrific. That's such a great description. And I know that for our viewers today, you have a reading from the book. And so while we bring up the artwork, please go ahead and let us know the words themselves.
Sure. So this is actually from chapter 19 of the book. And for those of you who haven't followed along, our main character has ended up on the USS Constitution. And I'll just read, a bit of this chapter. With one last gasp of energy, Hailey leaned back and heaved the big man over the railing. Then she collapsed back against the polished deck, breathing hard, next to the eagle, which she placed on the deck before helping Nick. It was dark out, somewhere between 2 and 3 in the morning, but between the moon and the lights from the pier on the other side of the ship, it was easy to see the details. And even from flat on her back, the details were beyond magnificent. USS Constitution was nothing like the reconstructed trading vessel Hailey had leapt from that short hour ago. Stem to stern, the massive Revolutionary warship was more than 3 times as long, and though the Constitution had been refitted and restored dozens of times over the centuries, it was still a working vessel, the oldest commissioned ship in the U.S. Navy. Normally, a crew of more than 60 served on it, though in Revolutionary times it carried as many as 500. And so here she was on her back on the deck of the USS Constitution, on the verge of what could be a history-changing discovery, a feat that made card counting look like a petty child's trick. She rose from the deck, scooping the Eagle under one arm. She'd actually been on the Constitution before, during freshman year at MIT, at one of those social mixers she'd been unable to avoid. Back then, so early in her grift and her carefully layered new identity, she'd still been concerned about appearances. A glance ahead told her Nick's piloting of the skiff had been on target. They were very near the stern of the ship. The three masts rose up behind her to dizzying heights. The main mast to 175 feet, but ahead the deck sloped only slightly upward, ending in a railing that seemed part of the current refitting. Planks from the railing had been removed, beyond which Hailey could see the water, a good 40-foot drop below. She started forward towards that gap in the railing. Nick followed, his head swiveling to take in the ornate woodworking on either side, the elegance and precision of the ship around them. Usually, visitors to the Constitution started in the museum dedicated to the ship on the pier, learning how it had been built in 1794 in a shipyard in the North End, just blocks from Paul Revere's home, and launched in 1797. How the ship had bested numerous pirates off the Barbary coast before it had made its name in the great battles of the Naval War of 1812. Almost at the stern and the break in the railing, Hailey noticed that a row of 3 of the ship's cannons had been moved up onto the deck from the cannon room below, probably part of the retrofitting. They were huge beasts, squat and heavy in the darkness. All 3 were on wheeled frames, their barrels facing out towards the ocean. Nick was now eyeing the cannons as well. Fake, I assume, he had said. Nobody's going to use them to sink our skiff on our way out of here if we manage to find this bell. The whole ship has been refitted and restored numerous times over the years. The cannons, too. Most were recast, iron dummies, not meant to be used. But a couple are active. They don't fire cannonballs. They've been hollowed out and retrofitted as 40-millimeter saluting guns, packed with gunpowder and saluting shells. They make quite a blast. They fire them twice a day when this thing is up and running. Nick raised an eyebrow, more at her encyclopedic memory than the mean-looking cannons. But she ignored him because she was already at the break in the railing. She paused, scanning the deck around her, looking for something she could use. Luckily, one was never far from rope on the deck of the ship. She skirted over to a coil resting by the base of what appeared to be a heavy copper tying post. She grabbed a heavy length of the rope and used her weight to drag it back to the break in the railing. Hailey, is this really a good idea? Hailey handed Nick the Eagle, then she looked around herself again. I'm going to need some sort of tool to pry it loose. She looked left and right, but there was nothing within range. Then Hailey noticed that Nick had pulled something out from the waistband of his jeans. He held it toward her. It was a tomahawk. I couldn't help myself, he said. Hey, you were fine with selling the stolen Gardner paintings. What's the difference? There's a big difference between making money off of something that's already stolen and stealing it yourself. It's what separates a card counter from a cheat. Nick rolled his eyes as Hailey grabbed the tomahawk from him. She slid it into the waistband of her skirt, then took the end of the rope in both hands. Nick moved further down the line, dropping to his knees in the deck and gathering rope in his own hand. Will you be able to handle my weight? Hailey asked. You just hang on to your end. It's a long drop down. Hailey turned and looked over the ledge. He was right. The water would feel a little like concrete if she fell from that height. But she didn't intend to go all the way to the water. Her gaze focused on a ridge about halfway down the stern, where something wooden and white and ornate had been affixed to the hull. She clutched the rope with both hands, then climbed over the break in the railing and began her descent.
Wow. Well, how about that? That's a real, leaving us with a real cliffhanger there too.
Yeah, ship hanger, I should call it, right?
Yeah, ship hanger. There we go. That is terrific. That was just great. Well, my first question to follow up on that great reading is this. It's about Constitution. I want to know, as an author, what drew you to USS Constitution. But I first should give you some context. One of the guests on our program today is the commanding officer of USS Constitution, John Benda, who's with us today. So you've got official ears hearing your answer. What drew you to the ship?
Well, that's an honor, by the way. I'm really excited, and I apologize now for any of the mistakes that are in the book about the Constitution, and I'm sure there are a number of them. I'm doing my best to call it a ship, and I understand it's a beautiful thing, and I've been on it. I did most of my research using the USS Constitution website, museum website. I was drawn to it. The book is set a lot around Paul Revere and his copper work. And so that led me, of course, to the Constitution, because Paul Revere had done the copper work below the waterline, which most people, I don't think a lot of people outside of Boston know. And also the bell. A lot of this book revolves around Paul Revere making bells. And at one point, he did make a bell that was on the Constitution that ended up being shot off the Constitution during a battle. So that was the link that brought me there. But I think from the very beginning, when I started this book, I knew I wanted to set the ending on the Constitution because it was just the perfect Hollywood. So I'm picturing a movie. As I wrote this book, I'm thinking, big movie. Where do you want to end a movie set on the Freedom Trail in Boston? You want to end it on the Constitution. And the fact that it's a working ship that really still sails around, people can see it. Years from now, people will think back to the book, I hope, when they see the Constitution. So that was it. I just thought it was a perfect ending place.
Well, that's terrific. That's terrific. And of course, we at the museum and the ship love the idea that the ship is in popular culture even today and bringing stories to people today. So that's terrific. Can you step us back to the beginning of the Mechanic? Here we're maybe a couple months ago. It didn't even exist. Can you tell us the origin story? Like, how did this even come about?
So basically, the editor-in-chief of the Boston Globe, Brian McGorry, and Linda Henry, who's the publisher of the Globe, they reached out to me because they had this idea to do a serialized novella, something that would appear daily in the newspaper for a couple of weeks. Their reasoning was, we're all getting all this horrible coronavirus news. Newspapers are full of all these negative things. It would be really nice if people who wanted a distraction could turn to something else in the paper. And serialized novels have been done before in history. You can go back to Dickens and Mark Twain, and Tom Wolfe did something like this. But I was really intrigued. They called me up and I thought, this is crazy, to write a book this quickly. But I only wanted to do it if I could do something like a Da Vinci Code thriller, something fully realized. And so I locked myself up for a couple of days and came up with this whole crazy plot. And I wrote the book in 2 weeks. It was a frenzied, wild couple of weeks, and it made me forget about the coronavirus. And hopefully for the people who were reading it, they were forgetting as well.
That's incredible. Have you written anything that fast before? Or is it normal for you? Help us give us a view of sort of Ben and the work. Yeah?
Yeah, so I write very quickly. I wrote Bringing Down the House, which is the book that I'm known for, which became the movie 21. I wrote that book in about 3 weeks. So I am a very fast writer, but this was intense. Also knowing that you had an audience waiting, chapter by chapter was added a little bit of pressure to it. But I've always been kind of a 24-hour just write in a frenzy kind of person. I don't recommend it to anybody out there who wants to be a writer, but it is the way I've always written. Yes.
Oh, that's great. Well, here's a follow-up from one of our audience members. This one is from Priscilla Connor. She wanted to know, how did you work out the flow and the pacing of the novella? It goes to the writing question, the craft question.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I knew with something like this that you needed to keep people coming back the next day. So part of the key was every chapter has to end on a cliffhanger. Everything about it is cliffhanger, cliffhanger, cliffhanger. Now, I didn't choose how much would go up each day. So the editors chose whether 1 chapter, 2 chapter, and then on weekends they gave you a little more. And they did that based on how they felt readers were going to be. So like on a Wednesday in the middle of the first week, you might only get 1 chapter, but on Friday and Saturday, you might get 2 chapters. So they were really thinking about how people were reading it. What was really cool is we were getting feedback as we went. So we knew that more people were reading it each day, that it was growing, and you could kind of figure out the pacing a little bit that way. But for me, it was always about, I got to keep people turning pages, because if they lose interest today, they're not going to come back tomorrow, and then it's over. So it was
there you go.
Yeah.
Keep the audience wanting more, right? So that's great. Well, certainly the Mechanic generated a great reaction from readers, and one of our audience members, Susan O'Brien, wrote in ahead of time to say, thank you, Ben, and thank you, Boston Globe, for the story, the style of presentation, and the thoughtfulness to providing that in a time when good diversions were very welcome. So could you tell us a little bit more about the audience reaction? When did you know, well, actually, before you wrote it, what were you hoping would be successful? And then when did you know, wait, well, this is something, this is a success on our hands?
I was hoping that people would have fun with it. I know that the newspaper isn't necessarily always that much fun. People read it because they want the news. And I was hoping for the most part, people would be turning to this because it was different and interesting, but it was still set in Boston, and I think it had some relevance. We knew pretty early on it was getting a great reaction because we were just getting tons of emails, and they were really wonderful. People were taking photos of a stack of the newspapers they were saving, or they would save it the next morning to read it with their morning coffee. Wonderful, wonderful email. Certainly, every now and then a correction. Someone would send in something I got wrong in my haste, and that was good too. And then the numbers just started getting bigger. We were noticing it was the longest engagement thing on the website. So it was something people were reading rather than just skimming or just looking at one sentence. And the audience was growing with each chapter. So by the end, there were 100,000 people, 200,000 people somewhere in there reading it together. It's like a big New England book club, which is really great. And it's all set within a couple hundred yards of where I live. So it was a very kind of fun, hometown-y situation. Listen, if you live in Boston, the Freedom Trail is your backyard. And anytime someone visits from another city, you pretty much have to take them around to these sites. So everyone in town knows all of this stuff I was writing about. But we don't all know the history. And so it was very cool to sort of show to some degree what really happened or what might have happened. And then something like the Constitution, which we've all probably seen or walked by, but most of us know very little about it. I think the average person has no idea there's a connection to Paul Revere and the Constitution. I think that's something maybe New Englanders know, but certainly nobody outside of New England would know. So it was interesting to sort of get into that.
That's terrific. That's terrific. And we have a question from Jeff Pikulik about the Globe itself to ask, did the length and the narrative need to be different because it was a Globe newsprint audience versus, you've written for TV, you've written for other media. So
so basically I got a couple of edits because it was written for a family audience, and sometimes my adult novels are a little, they had to cut a few things, let's say. Cut the language down to a family language. In general, the length was shorter. You couldn't, the average day I think was 1,500 to 2,000 words, which is like a long article basically length. So would a chapter normally be that short? Sometimes, but I was definitely had to do short chapters. And the book on its own was about 35,000 words. Normally a novel is about 80,000 words. Let's say. So it was smaller than which is why I intend to extend it a little bit. But you had to get to things quickly. So there were certainly scenes in the book where like Hailey and Nick are talking about something. Had I written a longer novel, they would have gone and seen that thing. So there were some areas. It was almost like writing for TV, which I do. In TV, you don't have the time to do everything you want to do. So you have to compress some things. And in this, it was neat. I've never been a newspaper man. I've never written for a newspaper before. So it was a lot of fun working on deadline and working with some great editors. And the artwork was unbelievable. But yeah, there were some constraints in the length.
Yeah. Well, a little bit of a follow-up. Since you mentioned you hadn't been a newspaper person, did you feel risk on your side, and did the Globe feel risk on theirs? I know they're sponsors, so please be careful whatever you want to say, but it just seems like it's a great leap forward by a great newspaper and a great writer in some way.
Yeah, so I mean, it was very, I put all the credit to the Globe for doing this because it is risky to do something, different. And newspapers are having a hard time. Magazines, journalism in general is in a very tough spot right now because by the time you pick up the newspaper in the morning, you've already read all the news on Twitter. So they're competing with so much. It was really great to be able to do things. I love newspapers. I love journalists. I think they're so important. So it was great to be able to do this. For me, the risk was just people wouldn't like it. But I've written 20 books at this point. There's plenty of books I've written that people don't like. So I'm used to that. I don't mind critics. There's plenty of critics to my work out there. It was more that I really wanted people to enjoy it and have fun. And that's the important thing. Is if anybody read it and was like laughing or smiling in the midst of an pandemic, I felt like I'd done my job. That was great. Yeah.
That's terrific. That's terrific. We have a question that's come in from Pauline to ask for you, Ben. What is something that you learned about the Constitution that you were surprised about? You mentioned you kind of knew a lot about it, but there's more that's to be known. Was anything surprising?
Yeah, so I learned a lot about the Constitution. First of all, the canon stuff, I didn't know a lot about, that they refitted one of the canons, or a couple of the canons, I think, were with these charges so that they can fire it off. I didn't know a lot about how that worked. I was not clear on the Paul Revere connection before. I didn't know about the bell that had been shot off the ship. I knew he had done the copper on the bottom, but I didn't really know a lot of the details. For me, and I think for a lot of people, it's hard to place historical figures at the right time period.
Mm,
So,
mm,
Revere and the Constitution, are they in the same time period? It turns out they
mm,
are kind of. They overlap a little bit. And I think those things you think of, at least I used to think of Revere as much farther back in history and the
mm-hmm.
Constitution in the 1800s, right? But Revere lived 83 years. So that's something a lot of people don't realize how long he lived. And for that time period, that was very
Right,
unusual.
right.
So that was something I didn't know. I think I might have gotten the height of one of the maths wrong. You guys would know better than me. But
We weren't going to push a little bit on that, but
yeah,
yeah, that is actually true.
fortunately, my dad is on here somewhere. You don't blame him. My dad is a sailor, and he was very happy I was using the Constitution, and I
There
was
we
sending
go.
him lots of questions. But he needs to come back to Boston and visit it with me when things open back up.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I definitely, really trying to describe it. The problem I had to work with was that, as you know, this is a ship that people are on, and I needed them to get there in the middle of the night and nobody be there. Obviously, I had to play with that. I don't know if we could really pull off what Hailey and Nick pulled off without anybody seeing you. But yeah, the whole the white eagle on the stern of the boat. I had done some neat research on your site and then farther back and how that had been replaced, and they had discovered that it had been done almost 100 years ago, right? And so that was a really cool little thing. The fact that there is an eagle, that it was known as the eagle of the seas, like it was a
Yes.
great connection to the whole book. Yeah, I learned a lot actually.
Well, that's great. Lifelong learning, right? That's what it's all
Yeah,
about.
yeah,
That's
absolutely.
great. So a build on that, some people wonder, do you write fiction? Do you write nonfiction? So, how much the mechanic is truth and how much of it is fiction? And how do you, as the writer, kind of navigate the two?
Yeah, so in the history in the book, I would say is more than 90% true. Um, so what I say about the Boston Tea Party, I think is all pretty true. It's a different telling of what we remember the Tea Party to be about. What people don't realize is John Hancock was a smuggler. That his goal in the Boston Tea Party was in part protecting his smuggling interests. What happened at the Boston Tea Party had less to do with taxation than it did to do with the East India Company and the amount of money it was making. And these are things that are alternate history in a way, but are really based on real things. So I would say most of the book is like that. The stuff about the gardener theft is all pretty much true. That eagle that went missing is very strange.
Hmm.
It had a very low value compared to the other things stolen. Why it was stolen still makes no sense. The person that I say may have been the person who robbed the gardener is the most likely candidate. Things like that, I think, are real history. The thriller itself, and then when you get into alchemy, you're getting a little bit crazy, but alchemy is a real thing, and real scientists attempted to do this, or pseudoscientists, pre-scientists. Revere was an alchemist. Hancock was an alchemist. Ben Franklin was an alchemist. And the fact that he made 300 bells is true. His obsession, what you could call it, with bells did grow and grow. He did call the King's Chapel bell the sweetest bell he ever made. Whether it was his last bell or not is something I maybe played with. But the fact that Revere was a technologist is a big part of this book. And that's something most people have no idea about. You think of Revere, you think of the Midnight Ride, which isn't even what
Mm-hmm.
really happened. But he was a scientist. He was the first person to make sheets of copper that could be molded in the United States. He was the one who, did the top of the State House in copper at one point. And so he was a genius of his time, and that's something that's pretty interesting.
That's terrific. That's terrific. And speaking of Paul Revere, I just want to ask you a little bit more. Is there anything, just like we asked, is there anything about the Constitution that surprised you? Anything about Paul Revere that surprised you? I think our
Yeah.
listeners
So
would
the
love to know
length
more
of his
about
life was surprising me. I didn't know people lived that long back then.
that.
He was building bells when he was 80 years old. And the extent of his work was really impressive. You think of him as a war hero. He was not a war hero. He was actually a very bad warrior. He actually was, dishonorably discharged and tried because of a failed battle, basically, which was one of the great failures of the Revolutionary War afterwards. He was a scientist. He was a maker of metal, a metal maker, a silver maker, an engraver. And all of that stuff was unknown to me. I mean, I knew he was an engraver. I knew there was Paul Revere silver and candlesticks and things, but I didn't know the extent of his work in copper and bronze. So that was interesting to me. And his later life after the Revolutionary War was stuff I knew nothing about. All you really knew about was the Midnight Ride. And then getting back to the mechanics, the title. You know, we knew about the Sons of Liberty, but I did not know he really was the forerunner to the CIA. He had a group, or FBI, I guess you would call it. He had a group of spies that he called the Mechanics, that he ran like his own little gang, and that Hancock and Sam Adams, would ask him for favors, and the Mechanics would go do them. So he did. The Boston Tea Party was a perfect example. You like to think of it as this populist uprising, but that wasn't really what it was. This group of mechanics were the ones who were carrying the tomahawks and dressed themselves up. These were guys who were tracking the British, and they were very controlled by Paul Revere. So he was an interesting character who was really led a group of spies around tracking the English at the time.
Terrific. So lots of dimension, uncovering lots of dimension in what we might have understood as our history. So let's connect to that science part as well. Here at the museum, we're known as History Museum, but we also have a lot of STEM information, a lot of science information around how Old Iron House was built, its innovative design, and those sorts of things. You mentioned you use our website for research, but there's science too. How did you do the science research? How much of the science is, like, does that really happen with sound waves and gold? And how did that go about?
Again, my dad is a scientist. He's a mad scientist. No, he's a MD PhD, and he had many patents in ultrasound and polygraphs, like that. So when I got into questions about sound and sound waves and that, I would immediately give it to my dad. And so the idea of sort of using glasses to measure the sound coming off of the bell, that all comes from him, and stuff like that. Basically, I do a lot of research. So I spend a lot of time, Googling. I'm a master Googler. But when I have an idea, like I want to learn about alchemy, I can spend a couple days just delving into pretty arcane stuff, into how it might work, what's not real and what's possible. What's intriguing to me is what they thought might one day be possible now actually is possible. You actually could change lead into gold using nuclear power. It would be vastly more expensive than any gold you'd make out of it. It would use an enormous amount of energy, but it's physically possible. And so that's the kind of thing that intrigues me. So I do a lot of scientific research. I've always wanted to be Michael Crichton. My whole career, I wanted to be Michael Crichton. I kind of fell into nonfiction. It was not my plan. I just happened to be hanging out with this group of MIT kids who were going to Vegas every weekend, and I realized it was a cool story, and then it became the movie 21, and then I met this, kid who co-founded Facebook, and it became the social network. It wasn't my goal to write these nonfiction stories. I wanted to write thrillers, so it was cool to be able to go back to what my real dream was, which was to write techno thrillers like Michael Crichton. And so I've always been intrigued. My family are all scientists. Both my brothers are doctors. My dad is a doctor, so I'm the black sheep of the family who is not a scientist, but I've always been around it. I have a lot of sort of networks to research that sort of thing.
Oh, that's terrific. That's terrific. But we have another audience question that has come in from Lois Siegelman, who asks, will The Mechanic be published as a novella in book format or expanded into a full-length novel? And have you had any interest in the story being made into a film? If it is to be filmed, will the USS Constitution be considered as a filming site if possible? Which, of course, in the museum we would love, but you're the writer. Tell us.
Oh, yeah. So I have great news. The great news to say, and it was announced in the paper about a week ago, I sold the movie to Steven Spielberg and Amblin, which is a dream come true for me. So Spielberg is going to be making the movie, and I am writing the screenplay, which is really fun and no pressure at all handing a screenplay to Steven Spielberg. So the goal is to shoot it in Boston, to make the movie in Boston. So of course it would be wonderful to do it on the Constitution itself. And then in terms of the book, I am going to extend it into a novel-length work. There was a lot I couldn't put into it, because of the format. I wanted to get deeper into the characters and their background. I wanted to get more into Hailey. I wanted to get more into alchemy, more into sound. All of the chapters could have been extended. So I would guess I'm going to add another quarter to the size of the book and make it book length. And then I'm also writing a sequel. So I intend to write many sequels. My goal is like the Da Vinci Code. This goes on for multiple books. I love these characters. I love the setting. I want to more. There are more revolutionary work characters that I know stuff about that people don't know about, and I would love to tell those stories. So yeah, I do intend to extend it on. And the book, I'm working on it now, completing it out, but I will have a publisher announced pretty soon as well. And so the timing of the book I'm not certain about yet, but there will be more, and I'm certain with the Globe I'll do some sort of partnership because it's been such a great. These readers are so awesome. The people who've been reading on the Globe are, it's my hometown, it's my family, and I love the fact that Boston embraced it. So we'll do some sort of excerpt or something like that with the Globe when the book comes out, so the audience can come back to it.
Oh, that sounds terrific. And so, building upon that movie question, maybe a little bit of a risk here, but casting such a favorite parlor game, do you, Ben Mezrich, have any? Wouldn't it be nice if such and such was this character or that character, or maybe who plays Ben Mezrich in the movie?
Right, I'm not in the movie, but I definitely have thought, when I write a book, I'm always thinking movie. From the beginning of my career, I always am thinking, how will this play on screen? Most of the time, I sell my movies before I even write the books. This was one of the first books I've written the whole book before I sold the movie. So usually I write a treatment and I sell it. So I always think actors. One actor who's expressed interest has been Ben Affleck, who would be intriguing for Nick. I think he'd be great. I think any of the Boston guys, Wahlberg, Matt Damon. I was thinking the professor could be Matt Damon in a wig. I've thought about some of those characters. Hailey is tricky. I mean, I think there's a lot of great actresses in Hollywood who could play her. With 20-something great actress out there. There's so many. I don't have a specific one in mind. I'm sure the audience can think of some of their favorites. I think with Spielberg, we'll have a lot of options, which will be great. And it will be the kind of picture that, hopefully people will gravitate towards. So, I would like to see some Boston-based actors in there. There's so many great actors who come out of Boston. But, it's so early in this that you never know. But as I get closer, I'll definitely let you know.
That sounds terrific. And building on the writing question, you're writing during the coronavirus, and I've heard that you chose to have Scenes in the Mechanic not have a lot of people so that it could be filmed. Is that right? Tell us.
I mean, it worked out that way. I wouldn't say I did it on purpose.
Okay. Yeah.
The book is written in such a way that every scene could be shot right now. I mean, because there isn't big crowd scenes, things like that. It's interesting that, I work on television now and on the show Billions, and you have to start thinking, how would I film this right now? Or do I wait a year? Because it's just so tricky, you don't want to do anything that's not perfectly safe. But what's great about this project is it's more about, in a weird way, it's about history, and it's intellectual in a strange way for a thriller. That you don't need a big crowd of people shooting guns at each other or car chases or things like that. It's more, smaller set pieces, which is interesting. But yeah, hopefully we'll be through all this by the time we're shooting this movie. So
that's great. And of course, when the book comes out, we'd love to have you at the museum for a book signing if we're able to do that too. So plant the seed for that. You've mentioned a few times Boston, and some of our viewers may not know where you grew up. Could you talk a little bit about being a New Englander, your attraction towards Boston, especially with this framework? Successful Hollywood, you could be in Los Angeles, right? You could be in New York, but you're in New England. So why Boston and why New England, and what keeps you here?
Yeah, so I've been living in Boston since the 80s, I guess.
Wow.
So a long time. I'm in the middle of the city, and I love Boston. All of my big books have taken place here. Bring Down the House, The Social Network. I wrote a book, Woolly, which takes place at Harvard, about the scientists trying to make a woolly mammoth. Most of my big stories are centered there. So many smart people come through the city. It's such a city that is built around education and the sciences and history. But to me, it encapsulates all the things I like to write about in one city. So I really fell in love with the city very early on. I went to college and stayed. Yeah, I love it. I think it's a lot of writers move to New York or LA. I did not want to. All my friends who moved to New York never actually wrote anything because they're so busy running around. And LA, of course, is beautiful. And for the Hollywood stuff, I go out there a lot, but you don't have to be there. The great thing about being a book writer or even a film writer is you don't actually have to be in LA. You can just hop in and hop out. You can be wherever you want to be. Boston is just a great place. I have kids, I have little kids, and there's not a lot of really great cities that you can raise little kids in. And Boston is one of those cities where you have something like the Constitution that you can walk to. I mean, you can walk to Fenway, and then you can walk to, Faneuil Hall, and you can't do that in a lot of cities. And so Boston has a lot going for it, other than the weather. That makes it really, really a great place to raise a family. And so, for me, it's always been about writing about smart people. I don't really write about criminals so much. I don't really write about, story of the week. I write about really smart people who pull something off, some sort of, and even the mechanic is that. It's like a really smart person who's pulls something off, trying to figure something out. That's sort of my thing. And I don't know if I would find those stories in another city.
Great. No, that's terrific. I love the idea of centering on smart people and becoming, achieving something or pulling something off. And certainly you've pulled off a lot throughout all of your novels as well. So we have with us a museum audience today. And so I'm going to ask you a museum question about, you mentioned you have your kids. What do you and your family love about museums overall? And a Boston question, how do you see museums playing a role in the Boston community as we all move to reopen and move through stages, 2, 3, and 4, and come together in communities in new ways?
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of museums. I love taking the kids to museums. I think it's so cool. I think that for me, just you can spend a day wandering through something that's air conditioned in the summer, or you can see pieces of real history. When you see something that was really there, I said a scene in the Tea Party Museum, and the idea that one of the crates from that Tea Party that was thrown into the water and pulled out is there in a case. I can just stand and look at that forever. And similarly, the Constitution is like a living piece of history. But the idea that 200 years ago, someone was running around on this deck, that Paul Revere was standing right here, maybe. That's cool to me. And so that's the kind of thing I don't think you can find anywhere else. I'm a big fan of museums. I love family-oriented entertainment. I love amusement parks too. So I'm not highbrow in any way. I love going to an amusement park and eating a really bad hamburger and then riding a roller coaster. But I love going to a museum and seeing a piece of history. And I like museums that take risks too. I like museums that do something with technology or do something a little bit more to engage kids right now who want to watch TV or play video games. I think museums can live that way. And I think, going forward, as we reopen up, it's going to be really important. I know a lot of these organizations, are suffering because what happened, is unprecedented. Everybody stuck at home, and it's really important, I think, for these things to reopen up. You guys are lucky that you're outdoors in a lot of it. So this is a place that people can go without a lot of danger, which is really, really great. I think indoor facilities are going to have a lot more trouble, obviously, than outdoor facilities. But listen, this is a moment in time. This is a blip. When I wrote this book, it was a distraction for me, and I wanted it to be a distraction for other people, because I think this is a unique moment in history that a year from now we're going to look back on as this shared crazy memory. And I love that the mechanic is going to be part of that memory, and maybe a good part of that memory, certainly for me. And so when I look at this moment for museums and things like that, we have to get through this. But a year from now, we'll be looking back at it. And the goal is, as long as we survive, and as long as we can find a way to get to a year from now, it's going to be like like something that is part of our shared history.
Our shared history and how we got all through it together with the help of the mechanic and other pieces. Well, thanks for mentioning the engaging family activities, and we'll have you back at the museum with the kids and come up to the second floor where they can practice climbing and loading a gun and just kind of all the scrubbing the deck and all the hands-on sets of activities. And so I guess one final question as we wrap here, you mentioned great things about museums. As museums ourselves, we like to think of ourselves as places of healing and hope, and we plan to do that through the virtual museum we've got going on now and when we can reopen. Are there any, as you think about your journey when you wrote The Mechanic, when you sat down, put pen to paper, thought, where am I now and where's this going and where we are now, can you reflect, and are there any words of hope that you might be able to offer as we all face this challenging time together?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, listen, there are fates worse in the world than being stuck at home with your family. So you have to look at sort of
nicely done.
the silver lining. There's sort of, it's a moment of reflection in an interesting way. There are positives to come out of everything. And, this is the project I never would have written. This is something that came out of this craziness that allowed me to sort of dive into it, delve into it, forget about everything else in the world. I wasn't doing it for money. I didn't get paid. I just gave it to the world basically because I wanted people to be able to experience something fun and out of worldly and exciting, even in this moment of doom and gloom or whatever else is going on in the world. And so I think I compartmentalize the world that way. There can be bad things going on over here, but that doesn't mean there's bad things going on over here. So for me, you can find your happiness and your all of that even within all of this craziness. And I also really do feel like there's a light at the end of the tunnel. I feel like even though things daily aren't looking that great right now in the United States, worldwide, we're getting through this. We're going forward. It's always moving forward. And I really do think, take the positives that you can out of it. Take the time to be with your family if you have a family, or take the time to write. I mean, what better opportunity is there if you're a writer than being locked in a house for 3 months? You got to write. So you sit and you write, or learn an instrument, or do whatever you can do. People are going to suffer, but that's something we all have to go through. At the same time, find the ways to make happiness, find the ways to see that light at the end of the tunnel and just drive towards it. You can read Winston Churchill, there's a lot of great lines in there about if you're in hell, keep going, right? So I feel like we're all moving forward, whether it feels like we're going back or not, we are going forward. And within a year or so, we'll be looking back on this and from a much better place.
Well, that's great. Well, thank you, Ben, for those words and also for your writing for The Mechanic and bringing joy to Boston in a difficult time. And also the opportunity now becomes Hollywood and a book and a platform and continues and continues.
Not ending. We're going to see The Mechanic in a much bigger way, I hope, in a year. And then the second one and the third one and the fourth one. And there will be a better, some people didn't want more of an ending. So you'll get a much bigger ending when the book comes out. And we're going to move on to Ben Franklin and electricity and some really intriguing stuff about that era of history.
That sounds terrific. Well, Ben, thank you for this fabulous, fabulous session today. You've been terrific, and it's great to have you join us. And we'd love to have you back at the museum when we can reopen, and love to be staying in touch. We want to say thank you to the Boston Globe, our generous media sponsor for today's event. And I want to give my thanks to the great crew of the USS Constitution Museum for their support. To all the viewers, I'd like to say, please join us at the museum on July 4th. You can go to our website, usscm.org, for details, but there's a lot of fun and engaging activities. The ship is going to be doing a lot of great virtual programming on Facebook Live on July 4th. So please come to the museum and go to the ship online, including a 21-gun salute at 12 noon by Captain Benda and his crew. Please don't forget to follow Ben Mezrich on Twitter and Instagram at Ben Mezrich to keep up with the latest from Ben. And I want to thank you all for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you all at future virtual museum programs. Check the museum website, usscm.org, for updates. And thank you, Ben, for joining us and joining the museum. Thank you so much.
Thank you.